Hi, everyone. I'm Darius Graham, and I'm thrilled to be in conversation today with Alex Budak. Alex is many things professionally: a founder, social entrepreneur, professor, and now an author. One of the best words to describe Alex is changemaker, and we'll talk a lot more about that word today and all the ways that Alex uses his creativity and expertise to help others become changemakers too. Alex is author of a new book, Becoming a Changemaker, an actionable, inclusive guide to leading positive change at any level. Welcome, Alex.
Hey, Darius. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you, not only because we get to talk about the new book, but because we get to reminisce a bit and go deep on work that we're both really passionate about. But before we get to the book, we really started this journey together many years ago. At that time, you and I were both based in DC. We were founders of separate organizations that shared a mission of helping people make a positive impact in their communities. Fortunately, our paths crossed back then, and I came to know you and the organization you were leading. So take us back to the very beginning of startsomegood.com. Where did the idea come from, and how did you begin?
Got lots of good memories of our time together in DC, Darius, and getting together over coffees and just talking about some of the ups and downs of being a social entrepreneur. It's great to have that sense of community early on. Yeah, so for me, the concept of Start Some Good came when I had the chance to live and work in Ahmedabad, India for a bit. And so while I was there, I was working with a group that worked with girls from the local community and used sport as a tool to teach healthy habits and leadership. And I came from a much more traditional background. I was in policy school at the time. I tended to think that change came from one or two big organizations, the places that most of my friends would go and end up working at, World Bank, IMF, etc. But there I started realizing that there's change makers quite literally everywhere around the world, but just too many barriers getting in the way of getting started. So I came back from India. I had sort of one foot still finishing up graduate school, and the other foot began my social entrepreneur journey. And along with my co-founder, Tom Dawkins, we started thinking about what are all the barriers that stop people from doing good, that stop change makers from taking action. And we thought, well, financial capital is one of them. We thought that the way we fund social enterprises is just broken, that who knows better what a community needs than the community itself. But we often have someone sitting in a room by themselves that's making those decisions. Said, how can we shift some of those power dynamics for how funding gets started and to give more risk capital, to give just that little bit of money that sometimes is a difference between an idea sitting and an idea turning into action. And that was the inspiration for Start Some Good.
And after that, you've gone on to help other entrepreneurs, people who were like you at that time, start other organizations. Tell us about your next step. That took you quite far away from DC.
That's right. So sometimes love wins out, and this is a story of love winning. So we were a couple of years into Start Some Good. I fell in love with a woman who got a job offer in Stockholm, Sweden. And we visited in June, and we fell even more deeply in love with each other and with the city. And then we moved in January, and I've never been colder in my life, but decided, hey, do I keep running Start Some Good from Washington, D.C.? Do I move with her? And decided, okay, I'm going to move with her. We're going to start this new chapter in Sweden. So I transitioned away from my work with Start Some Good. I'm still on the board, but decided to get more involved in the local social innovation community. And so I had the great privilege of running an incubator for social innovators, social entrepreneurs in Scandinavia, and traveled all around the region, giving talks and workshops to help more people start seeing themselves really as change makers. And so, of course, I was doing work on helping entrepreneurs with revenue models and measuring impact. But a lot of what I was doing was helping them step into their own change maker potential. And that's where that spark really began generating for me, of seeing, again, that potential in all of us to be change makers. And that sometimes we need financial capital in the case of Start Some Good. And sometimes we need some of the intellectual capital, knowing what to do, how to do it as well, which is what I learned in my work with Reach for Change.
Was there some commonality, Alex, between the entrepreneurs or people or change makers you'd work with via Start Some Good or your work in Sweden? Was there something that stood out to you as like they're all facing the same types of challenges, or we need to give them the same kinds of tools to really help amplify their work?
Well, I think the thing that really stuck out to me is the importance of community. And this is a lesson I learned myself. So I was fortunate to be part of this fellowship that supported young social entrepreneurs from around the world. And I remember we were in just outside of Istanbul, and we're standing on the cliffs, about to jump into the water down below. And there I was surrounded by 19 other young changemakers, social entrepreneurs from all around the world. So we had Mexico, Peru, South Africa, Uganda, Australia, Poland, Germany, like literally all around the world. And there was so much that was different about our lived experiences, about the type of impact we wanted to have. But there was also so much that united us, this belief that the world can be better and that each of us could play some role in making it so. And so I remember as we were standing at the top of those rocks and we were yelling 3, 2, 1, and then we jumped into the water. I remember splashing around and feeling this incredible sense of kinship and connection. Again, we couldn't have possibly had more different experiences between myself growing up in the US and my new friend Sambat growing up in Phnom Penh. But there's something united us, this idea of being change makers, about taking action in our local communities. And I think I carried that idea forward with me in everything that I did. So let's start some good. We were helping individual entrepreneurs, but we never lost track of that sort of community feeling that we're all in this together. And then, of course, with Reach for Change, I was building a community among 10 or 20 or so social innovators who were really pushing the envelope in a Scandinavian context. And they were doing good and important work, but it's also hard and tiring and exhausting to be a change maker many times. And so we did so in community, supporting each other. And I think that's been one of the themes that's run throughout my work in very different contexts.
Yeah, I love that theme of community and how it showed up differently, but so important in all the different roles you've had. So currently, you're on the faculty of the Haas Business School at UC Berkeley, leading a very, very popular course. So you've gone from founding and leading a startup yourself, helping others launch their ventures, to now teaching students how to become change makers. What motivated you to shift into this teaching role, and how did the course come about?
I mean, it's such a dream come true to be teaching. And a bit like Steve Jobs talks about, that you can't connect the dots going forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. And I think this has helped me realize that at my core, I'm a teacher and that I've always done teaching. It's just I've done it in different contexts, whether that starts with helping people figure out how to raise money, or Reach for Change, helping them figure out their revenue models. But really at its core, I've been teaching. And so this feels like a very natural fit for me. But I am just so grateful to be teaching at Berkeley Haas. I remember that it's really a stroke of good luck that I got to be here. I initially joined in a staff role, and then I went to talk with someone who sort of oversees all of the curriculum and faculty at Berkeley Haas. And I was going to him for advice on a career transition. About 15 minutes in, I think he could tell that my heart wasn't really in it. And so I distinctly remember he said, "Alex, what do you really want to do?" I said, "Well, what I really want to do is teach," and then made some excuses about how most faculty are older than me or blah, blah, blah. But to my shock, he said, "Okay, what do you want to teach?" In that moment, it got super clear for me. I said, "I want to teach becoming a change maker." And again, wasn't sure how he'd respond, but to my delight, he said, "Okay, put together a syllabus and show it to me and we'll go from there." And I remember like literally leaping out of my seat. I was so thrilled that he saw the potential here. I shook his hand, walked out of his office, closed the door, immediately pulled out my phone and Googled how to create a syllabus, because I had no idea. I'd never actually formally taught before. But he was willing to give me a chance in this. And it all made so much sense going forward that like, this is what I'm meant to be doing.
And the rest is history, as they say. Now it's a book. But before we get to the book, tell us more about the course. Can you walk us through, like over the course of a semester, what do students learn? What's the process that you take them through in learning how to become a change maker?
Break it down into 3 parts. So we start with a change maker mindset. Of course, change making can feel a little bit fuzzy to some, and I'm in the world of academia. So I'm conducting the first ever longitudinal study looking at how change makers develop over time. And so based on this research, we can see common themes, common ways of seeing the world that all change makers have in common, irrespective of sector or role or age or experience. So we talk about what are some of these key change maker traits, things like empathy and resilience and curiosity, adaptability, flexibility, things that will serve you well, no matter what type of change you hope to lead, whether it's a big organization or starting your own. So we begin with that change maker mindset, your way of seeing the world and your role in shaping it. From there, we talk about change maker leadership. So how do you come up with a vision for change? How do you inspire others to be part of that change with you? How do you use influence rather than authority to convince others this is a change worth pursuing? And then the third part is change maker action. So it's not change thinking, of course, it's change making. And so how do we take those first steps of action? What can we learn from artists and engineers and scientists about taking those first steps? Now, along the way, I'm a huge believer in the power of experiential learning. I think you can't just learn change making by reading a book. So we do a lot of hands-on exercises. For instance, when we talk about our resilience lecture, we talk a lot about the importance of self-care, about failing forward, but then we also have them practice failure. So towards the end of the lecture, I flash up a slide which simply has 2 words. It says, go fail. And students will sort of look at me and go, is he serious? And I go, yeah, I'm serious. Then the next slide comes on and it says, okay, you've got 15 minutes. You have to go leave the classroom. You have to go ask for something and purposefully get rejected. And you can't come back to the classroom until you've gotten that no. And so these students start responding somatically. They start sweating. I can see them start turning red and they get really nervous because, like so many of us, they're high achievers who are used to doing everything right. And so when I force them to get way out of their comfort zone and to go outside and fail, it's really uncomfortable. But it's by learning that failure firsthand and learning that one, failure isn't fatal, that no one laughs at them, and that so often students ask for something and they're sure they'll get rejected, but they actually get a yes. Those are lessons that you can only learn by actually going out and doing it. And so I want students to have that hands-on experience. We also tie that all together in the way the class ends. So as you can imagine, there's no multiple choice quiz that will test whether or not you're a change maker. So instead, I have them do a change maker project. So they work in teams and they identify a change they would like to see become a reality. It could be a change on campus, in the local community, at the state level, national level, even the world level. And then we use a tool I've created called the Changemaker Canvas, which is a way of breaking down a complex and perhaps overwhelming type of change and make it actionable so that they can feel like, okay, I can actually do something about this. So they use that canvas. And then along the way, and this is something very much inspired by our shared worldview, we give them just a little bit of seed funding. So we give them $100 per team, which is just enough to get over one of those barriers. So that way, when they launch what we call their minimum viable project, their Changemaker project, they have just enough money to get started. If they want to host an event, well, great. They've got enough money to buy some pizzas. They want to do a raffle. They've got enough money to get some gift cards. So again, $100 isn't a ton, but it's really empowering to them because it takes away one of the reasons we may feel like we can never take action on change. So together we try to do both the empirical social science about what it takes to lead to change, then the hands-on experiences where they go practice it. And then the third important part is bringing in guest speakers. So people like you who have experienced change in so many different roles and sectors. I'm a big believer that you can't be what you can't see. And so I want my students to see change making in many different roles and many different types of people. I recognize that not every single student will see themselves in every guest speaker, but I'm really confident that every student will see a bit of themselves in at least one of them. And by seeing these different paths forward, I think it can illuminate a bit of that confidence and that assurance that, hey, I can be a change maker too.
Yeah, and thanks again for the invitation to speak to your course a while back. It was just wonderful to share my experience and hear the great questions that the students had. And now I want to get into the book because you've taken what started as this course and now made it into a book, Becoming a Changemaker. How did the book come about and what are your goals for it? And I imagine this may be a little tough for you because being a teacher and you get to be really hands-on and in person with the students for the most part. But this book is out there in the world with, lots of people. So what do you hope people will get from reading this book?
One of the most meaningful things that you can ever receive as a teacher is a note from a student which talks about how your course changed their life. And I've been really fortunate to receive that from a number of students. And as I started receiving more and more of these notes and seeing firsthand how they put these principles into practice, I started realizing, well, there's an opportunity here to get it outside of the confines of Berkeley. Berkeley's an amazing place, but Berkeley doesn't have a monopoly on being change makers. And I want people from all walks of life to benefit from these ideas, from these lessons as well. And so that was really the inspiration, is that we sort of tested it at Berkeley. We know that these ideas work. And now how can we get it out to more people? I'm not one of those people that set out to be an author. I'm a perhaps reluctant author because it's such hard work to put together a book. But I did it really with this sense of mission and purpose, which is to try to get these ideas into the hands of as many people as possible. And a book is, I think, an amazing way to do it. my hope is that the book really captures the magic of the class. I even provide some of the same exercises in the book that I ask my students to do, so you can practice yourself as you read. But regardless, I hope that doing this in a book form allows me to reach people in a very different way, to increase the number of stories that I tell, to go even deeper into some of the research and some of the studies, and to really help people get unstuck. I've heard from so many people that feel like they want to be part of change, they want to lead something, but they just feel like they can't get started. And so I really wrote this book for people like them to say, look, you can get unstuck. There's a path forward. This works. And just give them a bit of that courage and encouragement that they need to get going.
Great. And I know everyone watching this is going to read the book, but there are just two things from it that I really wanted to highlight in this conversation. First is you talk about challenging the status quo as an essential act that change makers have to do, but that we have to do it very strategically, carefully, thoughtfully. Can you say more about how to go about challenging the status quo as a change maker?
Yeah, it's one of the key themes for being a change maker. It's recognizing, I love the words of poet Amanda Gorman. She says, "For there is always light if we're brave enough to see it, if we're brave enough to be it." This idea that there is always a better way forward, but it's not enough to just recognize it. We've got to see it when others may not see it, but then also have the courage to step up and do something about it as well. So there's two parts to this. The first is sort of recognizing what needs to be changed. And there we can lean into our curiosity to practice sort of what we call divergent thinking. So being open to many different stimuli and not getting into any one solution too quickly. But then there's also the practical, like, how do you do it? How do you go about challenging it? Now, Darius, you brought up something important, which is that you can't just be challenging every single status quo at all times. If you do that, you run the risk that, well, one, your coworkers start thinking you're kind of annoying, and two, you become less effective as you go. So there's great work done by psychologist Edwin Hollander. He has something called idiosyncrasy credits. Idiosyncrasy credits tell us about how we can sort of earn up the credit to go our own way, to zig when others zag. And so you can earn these either through competence, so by doing really good work, or by tending to go with the flow on some things. So that way, when you diverge from the group, then they know you really care. You're not just a contrarian. You care about the changes that you want to question. And so when you say, look, I've gone with you on these 5 things, but on this one, on this diversity, equity, inclusion effort, I feel really strongly about this, then people are more apt to listen to you. But there's a whole suite of tools that you can learn, from how you can learn to reframe risk, how you can learn to take more smart risks that we talk about in the book, that I think will give you this sort of toolkit. So it's not enough to just recognize, right? Not enough to just see the light. Got to be it as well. And so give you kind of a toolkit and an approach for how you can more effectively question the status quo.
I love that. And the other concept that stood out to me, which I've heard you talk about before, is micro leadership. For folks that haven't heard that before, tell us about micro leadership.
It's a brand new concept that I put forward. And I think that so often when we think about leadership, we tend to think about the one single heroic act. Lech Walesa scaling the wall, or Steve Jobs pulling the iPhone out of his pocket. And when we see those big acts of leadership, most of us tend to think, well, that's not me. I'm not the naturally charismatic leader. I'm not the extrovert. I'm not the one that wants to lead change in front of tens of thousands of people. But I think when we consider leadership through that lens, it does a disservice to what it means to actually be a leader. I believe that leaders might be scarce. So maybe there's only one CEO or executive director in your firm, but leadership is abundant. We can all practice leadership. And so, inspired by that, I break leadership down into what I call its smallest meaningful atom: leadership moments. So rather than thinking about, I've got this one big grandiose thing, instead, the question is, there's these leadership moments that appear around you all the day, all time, all day, every day. Can you have the courage to step up and seize them? Maybe it's in a meeting where everyone is saying yes, you're willing to say no. Or maybe in a meeting, you recognize that one of your colleagues hasn't raised their voice. You say, hey, no pressure, but we haven't heard from you. Would you like to share your perspective as well? There are tons of these leadership moments that appear around us all the time. And so my challenge for you to practice micro leadership is, instead of letting them go by and say, oh, that's for someone else, can you give yourself permission to step up and do something about it and say, hey, I'm going to seize this moment? And what's so powerful about leadership moments, about micro leadership, is that you'll never go too far. It's small little leadership moments. You won't overstep your bounds, but rather you'll start practicing that muscle of leadership. You'll do more and more and more. More people start seeing you as a leader, but most importantly, you'll start defining yourself as someone who sees opportunities and takes action on them. Small little moments to lead change from where you are, and I think it's a really empowering concept.
Well, I love both of those concepts. And the other thing that I love about the book is that you include stories of real people who are leading change. And I'm not just saying that because I'm in it, which I'm also grateful to have my part of my story shared in the book. But you give these really great examples of people that are, doing all the things that you talk about in these concepts. Can you share just one example of a person that you wrote about in the book?
It's so hard to choose because I'm very deliberate in choosing examples that aren't just your typical CEO or executive director type of stories, that I want everyone to see a bit of themselves in these stories. So just to choose one, since we were talking about questioning the status quo, I'll tell the story of Lila Olgren. So you may not know her name, but no doubt we have all benefited from her insight and the technological change that she made possible. So this is back in the 1970s, and she was working for the Swedish telecommunications agency. And they were trying to figure out how to make the world's first mobile phone work. So they were practicing in cars as they were driving and trying to get the phone to be able to dial. They said, okay, we think this is the future. How can we get phones just like in the house, but how can we get them in a car and make it work? They kept running into the same issue, that you would start dialing the number and then the car, as it would be moving, would get in the shadow of a tree or a tunnel and it would lose connection to the radio tower. And the team started losing hope that this would ever be possible. They thought, well, maybe it's just not technologically possible. They were trying to take the exact same experience that we had in our house on our home phone and transport it into the car. And they thought, well, maybe mobile telephony just isn't possible. But Lila Olgren saw things a little bit differently. By the way, she was the only woman on an otherwise all male team. But she saw things a little bit differently. And she said, why are we trying to recreate the exact same model of being in a house when we're in a car? That's a model we don't necessarily need to adopt. What about when we thought things a little bit differently? At the same time, the power on transistors was just becoming powerful enough that could store a little bit of data. So instead of the old model, which would send a number one at a time as you dialed all 7, 8, 9, 10 numbers, instead she said, okay, what about if we dial the numbers, we store it on the circuit, and then only once you have all those numbers, then we send it to the radio tower. It's a small, simple insight. And again, looking back 50 years from now, it feels like, well, quite obvious. But no one on her team could quite come up with that idea because they were so stuck in just doing things the way that they had always been done. She saw things differently. She dialed up her curiosity. And as a result, she's changed the way that our mobile phones work today. So even if you've never heard of Lila Olgren, now when you use your mobile phone, you can know that, hey, there's someone behind this who came up with one little changemaker insight, and that made all the difference.
Yeah, that's a really great example. Where can people go to learn more about your book, the course, and the tools that you talked about in the book?
Oh, thanks. You can go to changemakerbook.com, learn all about the book, links to purchase it as well. And you'll see some stories that are involved as well, and some resources.
Well, Alex, I am just so grateful for being in this conversation with you, grateful that our paths crossed when they did. And I'm just eager to see all the great things that happen from this book being out there in the world. So thank you so much for being part of this conversation today.
Oh, thank you, Darius. And I have to say, you're one of the first changemakers that I met on my own changemaker journey. So thank you for all of the inspiration that you've provided me along the way. And thanks for trusting me to tell a bit of your story in the book as well. And finally, thanks for having me today. Enjoyed our conversation.
You're welcome, and thank you.